a first step, I'd like us to start by stretching our physical muscles a little bit. So it's the end of the day for some of us, it's the beginning of a long day for others. So I'd like to invite you to start by breathing, taking 3 deep breaths, simply to get together into this space where we are together. Now I'd like to invite you to gently stretch your arms up and see how far you can get. What I'd like you to do is, as you stretch your arms, see whether you can extend them a bit further if you just stretch from lower and lower down in your body. So what happens if you stretch just your fingers first? Then what if the stretch comes from all of your forearms? What if it comes from the middle of your back? And what happens if it comes from your lower back? As you do, I'd like you to just see whether you can create a bit more space inside of your body. Just that extra space for stretching. Maybe you begin the stretch from your thighs, even all the way down from your feet, and all the way up to the tip of your fingers. Just see how much space you're able to create. Now let's see whether we can do that going forward. So, can you touch the screen where you are? Can we almost have very weird ASMR style experience of touching our fingers on the screen like this? What does it feel like if we do that? And again, see whether by breathing or by stretching from lower down, you can gain a bit of space inside of your body. Now I can bring the arms back and stretch them on the side. See what happens if we do that. How far we can go. So now that we've stretched our bodies, I'd like us to extend this stretching exercise to our awareness or to our mind. And I'd like you to look at the room around you, wherever it is, small or big, the objects that are in that room. And I'd like you to extend your awareness to feel all of the room where you are currently located physically. So try to see if you're able to feel the room at the back, behind you, whatever is in front of you. There may be a window, there may be a door, there may be a wall. What's on both sides of you? I'd like you to be very, very present in the space where you're physically located. Now I'd like you to bring your awareness back to your body. From the room to your body. And then to concentrate it in your face and in your eyes. As your awareness concentrates in your face and your eyes, I'd like you to start shifting it to the screen in front of you. To bring your awareness to the Zoom window, or whatever window is in front of you, to the other people that you can see on that Zoom window, I'd like you to select one of the people who are in front of you. Just bring your awareness to that person. So somewhere between your eyes and the image of that person on the screen. And then I'd like you to extend your awareness to the body of that person. Imagine what it would feel like to be inside their body on the other side of the screen right now. What might it be? Then I'd like you to expand your awareness yet further and imagine what it would be like to be not just inside their body, but inside the room where they are. I'd like you to imagine, to project yourself into that space on the other side of the screen, where that person you've chosen is currently located. And see if you're able to stretch your awareness to that space and what that feels like. Now, as you keep your awareness in that space, I would like you to stretch it further to the other people that you see on the screen. What would it be like to be in two rooms at once and in the bodies of two people at once? 3 people. What would it be like to be in the rooms of 3 people at once and in the room where you're currently present? I'd like you to see whether you're able to stretch your awareness so that it's located both in all of the spaces where we are currently together and in the space where you are individually, physically located. Simply see whether you're able to stretch there. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'd like you to take a breath, feeling this awareness, and then slowly return as you exhale back to where you are. Back to your own body, back to your own space. Thank you. How was that?
Pretty interesting, actually.
I
don't think I've ever done that before, to really try to be in different spaces at once.
So this was our first stretching exercise. What we're going to do together is not to look for solutions to what it might be like to negotiate a new normal, not even really dig into the abstract or cognitive dimensions of the problem, but more try to work on some of the core muscles that might allow us to start to see the large systemic challenges that we face from multiple perspectives at once, from the perspectives of people who come from different traditions. And as a first step to frame or to invite you to this workshop, I'd like to start with a story. And I'd like to tell you, or to take you through this story to another space. So it's a cold afternoon of December, and we're inside a room in a house in a small village in Lorraine, in northern France. It's the kitchen of my mother's parents, and I'm sitting at a table with my grandmother. There is wood burning in the stove, and there is an apple tart on the table. Not much left of the apple tart because a lot of it is inside my body at that stage. And I'm sitting next to my grandmother, and everything is painted blue. And we're having a chat after a very nice meal. I'm there on a visit. And as happens when you visit your grandmother, she's 85 at the time. She starts telling me stories about her childhood. Probably she wants to to pass them on. And she looks at me and she looks at the apple tart, offers some to me, and then says, I wanted to share this story with you of when I was a little girl, you know. When I was a little girl, we didn't have much money. It was after the war. It was after the First World War. Both of my parents were working, and I was looking for ways to make a bit more money. And what you did at the time was you went out into the fields and dug for scrap metal. So my grandmother explains to me how she would go all day around the field, digging for scrap metal that she could then sell. And there was a lot of metal there because it was exactly the place where the trenches of the First World War had been dug just a few years before. So metal left over from the war. And she told me there was one day when I was really excited. I had found this piece of metal, but it was attached to something very big. And I tried to dig it out and I couldn't. And so I run to the factory where my father was working and I said, Dad, can you help me dig this out? I found this big piece of metal. And she said, I convinced him. He came with me and she described how that day her father had left the factory for a few minutes. It was nearby and helped her. And there was this enormous piece of machinery that they got out. It was weighed a lot. They carried it back home. They sold it, made quite a bit of money on it. And she said, and then he gave me some of it. And I was able to get all sorts of lollies. And it was wonderful. So she shares this story of joy with me. And then she looks at me and she says, you know, at the time we were also digging for other things. We're digging for bones to make glue. And at that moment, I think back that these are the places where the trenches of the First World War were dug. So I paused for a moment and I said, bones. You mean human bones? My grandmother looks away and says, I don't know. I wanted to share this story with you because it's a story that's shaped me. This history of coming from a place that was torn by war, where people have fought with each other, and where the way that you could bring things back together, glue them together, was through the bodies of soldiers. And I think a thread through my life has been to try to find ways of binding things together without it needing to be done through the bones of people in a less violent manner. And there's a moment when it's defined a number of professional choices, but particularly one that I made in 2016, 4 years ago. And that ties to how I come to be here. I worked for a few years with an international organization called the Global Challenges Foundation that was looking at governance solutions to reduce global catastrophic risk. How can we create governance systems at the international level, improve the functioning of the UN, or create alternative organizations that could prevent catastrophe from the world, catastrophe from climate change, catastrophe from nuclear war, or from new technologies going rogue. And the way that we proposed to do that was to organize a very large prize competition. We invited people, experts from all over the world to come up with new solutions on how we might organize governance systems around the world. And there were over 2,000 responses. We ran a large event. And in the aftermath of this competition, the executive director, Karen Nizam, who will be talking at this conference, and myself, went out to create an organization called the Future of Governance Agency and write a book called How to Rule a World. And the reason we wanted to write a book is we realized through this effort how important it was to understand how governance works, but also how many people seem to go about in the world having somewhat missed part of the civics class, or not being able to keep up with all of the new possibilities offered by technology to organize our decision-making and hold our world together. So we went on to write a book that's going to come out soon. And essentially what we're talking about there is how to exercise power. Power being quite simply the way that your desire or your will gets manifest into the world. And typically for that to happen, you need to have other people work with you in order to do something. My grandmother could only get that piece of metal out of the earth by convincing her father somehow. That's an exercise of power. But in order to do anything on a larger scale, we need to not just exercise power one-on-one, but to create structures and systems that just regulate or stabilize the exercise of power. And that's anything from government to markets, to borders, to citizenship, or to accounting registers. And there's a number of tools that have been designed over the course of history that have been put to use by humanity to organize our societies. But the rise of new technology, of digital technology, has brought new tools into the world that allow us to do that differently. And that work of thinking about the tools to organize power obviously aligns with the work of that conference around negotiating a new normal, because any type of new normal that we're creating also is going to be a new system or a new structure to organize and stabilize power. One thing that's very important for any governance structure is the stories that lie behind it. And it's the understanding of how the world works and how the world came to be what it is. And those stories are essentially what binds a culture together, or a group of people who share a common tradition. So what we're doing now, this cultural empathy gym, is something that I've designed both to kind of help through the work of this conference, to just see how thinking about the stories and the stories that underpin different governance systems might help us listen differently, but it also can serve as a practice in a range of other settings, wherever people from different traditions come together and need to work together as a kind of a warm-up, so that whatever conversation or negotiation happens is done with bodies and with minds that are warmed up and a bit more flexible. So the idea is that if we can do that, if we can build this flexibility in ourselves, maybe we'll be able to negotiate difficulty and conflict a bit better and be less directly reactive. And the way I propose to do that is through two main activities, looking at our own relationship to space and our own relationship to time. So let's jump into it. First one, let's look at space and at the spaces that we inhabit. So I'd like you to think back about the place where you're born, and I'd like you to write it down in the chat box, just so we have a sense of where the people who are currently on this call, what is the space where you originated? So just in the chat box, and you can write the name of the city and the name of the country. So it's me. Hello. Welcome, Jan. You have joined us after our warm-up. So we're looking, Jan, at the place where you were born. This is where we're at, as a first step in an empathy stretch. So an exercise to figure out how we can expand our awareness, our sense of self to people who see the world from different perspectives and different traditions. China, can you write the city and the place in China? So we have Waterloo, Sacramento, Strasbourg, Chambéry, and a place in China. So that's the spread of the world where we're at. Now I'd like you to use the magic of the internet to reconnect to the place where you were born. So I'd like you to go to a Google tab, write down the name of this place, and look at it on Google Map. And scroll out just to a scale where you see something that is interesting. And maybe it's the further away that you can go, or maybe it's a bit closer. Just go to Google Maps type down the name of the place where you were born, the city where you were born, and scroll down until you see something where you think, oh yeah, that's a scale that's interesting to me in terms of the relationship of where I was to the rest of the world. And one thing I'd like you to pay attention to as you do this is look at the borders that are present on this map. So map centered on the place you were born, because each of those borders defines a different culture, a different state with its own center of gravity, its own probably media system, jurisdiction, history, and stories that circulate. And I'd like you to reflect that as you look at this map, at the time when you were born or when you were growing up, maybe when you were growing up, if you were still living in that place, what was the center of your world? Or what were the different centers of your world? And those centers may be maybe the capital of the country where you were, or maybe places where a lot of the media that you were looking at was from. Maybe it was where the head news agency was, or maybe places where a lot of the fiction that you were watching or reading was shot. Or it could be another center, maybe a place that was not the place where you were born, but where your family had very strong roots, and that somehow felt to be your real center of gravity. Or maybe it's just another place in the country where you were in another country, or it could be just a place in the world that seemed central for whatever reason. So I'd like to look at this map and try to look at where was the center of the world and how did it relate to the place where you were born. And now I'd like to get into breakout rooms and give you 5 minutes to discuss this experience. So 5 minutes in pairs to reflect on what you observed by looking at this map of the world and reflecting on the centrality of, or what was the center or what were the centers. So Samir, are you able to break down people in pairs?
I actually am not.
I can do that now.
Yeah.
Leslie, you are able to do that? Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
So maybe we can send Jan with Sam and Samir with Patrick. Hello, everyone is back. I see smiles, that's wonderful. So now I'd like us to take a second step. We've been looking at the places where we were born. I'd like you now to write in the chat the place where you are currently located. So city, country. Just so we have some idea of where we are all from. Singapore, Singapore, Tokyo, Japan, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, Wollongong, Box Hill, Australia. Wonderful. So now I'd like you to do what we did before we had our place of birth. Write the name of the place where you are currently located on Google Maps. And I'd like you to scale out and look at that map of the world centered on the place where you are currently located. And here again, I'd like to invite you to look at the lines that exist on the map. where are there borders or divisions between different states, separated by different traditions, languages, histories, with different center of gravity? How close are you to those borders? Maybe what defines those borders? Are they natural? Is there a body of water or a large chain of mountains? Or do they seem more arbitrary? And I'd like you to do the same exercise of reflection that you did before, thinking about where is the center of the world for you today? Is the place where you are the center of your world? Or do you feel that the world centers on a place that is different? Or that there are multiple centers that you relate to, each with its own pull, so its own gravitational pull? And those other centers may be a place, the place where you were born if you have moved, or the place where your family is currently based, or maybe a place that's very important in your environment. Maybe you don't live in the capital, and so the capital has a pull, or a city in your region that is more important than the one where you are, or any other place that may be central. And now I'd like you to look at this map and think back at the one of the world centered on your place of birth. And ask you, is it the case that the center of your world has shifted? And how close to the center of your world are you now, as opposed to when you were little? Are you closer to the center of your world? Or are you further away from it? And how does that affect your sense of gravity and your sense of space? And now I'd like to break out into rooms again. And Leslie, I was wondering if we could break out for 6 minutes and possibly have different groupings than we had the previous time. So maybe we can have, say, Samir with Patrick and Sam with Jan. And I might join either of them.
Leslie, are you there?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I missed my name.
No worries.
Oh.
Sorry, you asked
So
something?
Leslie, I was asking, yes, sorry, if we could break out into rooms for 6
definitely.
minutes.
Do you want the same rooms as before?
No, different rooms than before.
Okay.
And I was saying maybe Sam with Jan and Samir with Patrick, and I can be with either of those groups. Welcome back. How is that?
We had an interesting conversation.
Wonderful. I'd like to take just a few minutes to gather insights before we move on to our next part. What were some of the insights that emerged from the conversations in the room? I'm curious because I wasn't in them and I couldn't overhear.
No, what was interesting is that we both had probably, like, looking at where everyone was born and everyone is now, which is a different place, right? You have like the US and Australia, and US but not really, and Pakistan and Netherlands and China, Singapore, even usually from France to Australia, and me from France to Japan. So the centers are shifting, which is first not that doesn't happen that often, I guess. I mean, I know a lot of people whose center hasn't shifted forever, and it's still the same.
It's interesting. That is a pattern, definitely, that our centers have shifted. So when I was talking with Liuan and Patrick also, that was very evident. We've moved, our center shifted, this is clear. But what's also interesting that I'm just thinking of now is that now in the past year or so, my center has shifted even more now. If you think about this whole Zoom thing and working from home, now where the heck's our center? Is it like in the fiber optic cables? I don't know, but it's just expanded or something. I don't know. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, Zoom led to us living in a world that's even more out of kilter, or out of center than what we used to. Is there any other insight that you wanted to share, or reflection that emerged?
I think picking up from what you said, Samir, there's this idea of, like, we talked a lot about how we define our center. Like, Leon, do you want to share a little bit about how you, because I thought it was so interesting how you were defining through stories your center.
Yeah, I think that one thing like worth sharing is that after leaving China for so many years, moving back to China in 2007, it wasn't really my choice, but it just happened that way. And after living there for another 6-7 years, I just felt like completely out of breath. And I told Sam that it was like you go into a big room full of people and you go and like cut through, go right away in the center, and you just couldn't move anymore. And moving to Singapore gave me a kind of freedom that, like, you take a strategic position in this big room and perhaps in the corner or near the bar, but you have a kind of overview. And it gave you so much more space to move around and choose who you want to talk to. And in China, you're so sucked into China. Everything's about China. And after living around the world for so long, I just felt like, I can't be bothered. And so that kind of, but still, I wanted to stay close to my family in China. So Singapore is not too far, but Australia is too far. And I just share with Sam, I almost moved there, but then my parents-in-law cried. They said, "Oh, you guys already moved away from Netherlands and so far away, and now move even farther to Australia." I was like, "Oh, wow, that's an interesting way to look at it." So that's a big decision for us not to move to Australia because it's too far away.
Thanks for sharing, Jan. There's a thing that I'd like to reflect on, which is how being very close to a very dense center can lead to we can feel that we're at the center of things and it's exciting, but it can lead to a reduction of freedom because there is so much gravitational pull almost that we can't really move so freely. While when we're slightly off center, it's something that we're maybe much more able to do. And so we find freedom in detaching ourselves from places of centrality or by having multiple ones. I'd like to reflect on my own story as a transition towards the second half of the workshop, where we'll be looking at stories, where I've never been at the center, or I've never felt that I was really in the center, but that I always inhabited a world that had multiple centers. I grew up in Strasbourg, which is the European capital. So at the very center of something very big that was growing at the same time as myself. At the same time, being in Strasbourg, I was on the border of the country where I was, France. There was my city, there was a river, and on the other side of the river was Germany, while the center was Paris, that was quite far from me. And most of the TV that I saw and media, etc., the political power was all centered in Paris, far from where I was. And then I had family that came from the Mediterranean down south. The word Mediterranean itself means middle of the earth, and Mediterranean families keep telling you, you are really from here, and north of the mountains are barbarians. So there was this sense that where I was where the barbarian lives. Jan is laughing because you recognize something that may be the case in China as well. And then I was studying English. Yes, exactly. Same thing. And I was studying English, and the world at the time when I was born in 78, so in the 80s and 90s, there was a sense that the United States was the center of the world, that English-speaking world, and that was not where I was. So I was really operating with these different centers. And then in 2008, I met an Australian and decided to move to Australia. And then my world got even more out of center, because suddenly by moving to Australia, I became aware of everything in between, and that's Asia. And that was enormous, and I knew nothing about it. And so in order to migrate, I kind of expanded my world even more and tried to see what it would be like to inhabit a world where Asia was one of the centers. And so when I did that, I went through an exercise in expanding my empathy. It's a very simple exercise. I watched Taiwanese romantic comedy. There was a service called PP Stream at the time, and I became completely addicted to them. And it was a way to simply empathize with the stories of those people who inhabited those places that before didn't exist to me, and I wanted them to exist. So I just related to the fictional world. And in one of those stories, something happened that was a real penny that dropped. I can't remember what the exact plot was. It was about a young Chinese businesswoman who had all sorts of romantic adventures while also pursuing a career. And at one point in the series, this young woman gets on a plane and she goes to Japan. And that moment was a life changer for me, because I realized that I was 31 at the time, and I had never imagined that a person from China could go to Japan, because I had grown in a world that was so Eurocentric that I was able to think of other countries in relation to where I was, but not in relation to each other. And it was a real shock to me to discover that up until then, I had not been able to directly imagine that the rest of the world, other places in the world, related to each other in the same way that I related to others. And since then, I became obsessed with the desire to understand and share the stories of people who are not in my world and how they related to each other outside any of the traditions that I was a part of. And that became almost a kind of game. And that applies to, of course, what we may call national cultures or ethnic cultures, but the same kind of patterns that we were looking at in terms of centrality and cultures. Whether you're somebody who sees the world in terms of engineering, or of marketing, or of startups, or of government, and also in terms of the big problems that you work on. Whether you're a person who cares about the environment, or a person who cares about women, or a person who cares about human rights, or a person who cares about the digital world. Each of those is almost a different point of centrality. And if we look at one of the things that really excited me about the conference, that this Negotiating the New Normal conference, is how there are parallel threads that are looking at these different systems, each of which may claim centrality. How can we create a world that is multilateral? How do we think the future of globalism? How do we think the evolution of the digital world? How do we think the evolution of capitalism and production to protect the environment? So each of those is a major problem, but in order to negotiate a new normal, we need to think of them together. And we have a number of people, each of us probably, is used to having one as a main center. So the question is, how can we see the world from the perspective of someone who is used to having another one as their center? And how do the others relate with each other? So up until now, we've been looking at space. Now I'd like to shift to the question of time and think about the stories that we tell ourselves about how the world that we inhabit came to be what it is. So we're talking about negotiating the new normal because the current normal is probably not exactly what we want it to be, and we may be very concerned about it, whether it's what happens with environmental collapse or geopolitical tensions or dangers, opportunities, threats coming from the rise of the digital world. All of those things coming together create a situation that we often describe as a crisis. What I'd like us to do now, I'm always very aware of possible introverts in the room, and we've been exchanging a lot. So I'd like us to take 5 minutes of reflection, grab a piece of paper and a pen, and in 5 minutes, do a meditative, entirely free journaling activity where we reflect, how did we come to the present situation of the world? So how do we get to where we are today? And I will not ask you to share it, so you can feel entirely free to write it in whichever way you want. We'll do that for 5 minutes, and we can even close our camera if that gives you more privacy. That was an invitation to rejoin. How was that? So now I'd like to invite you to reflect on the piece that you just wrote and notice if it has any particular mood. What kind of story did you tell? Was it a story where the main mood is anger, or fear, or gratitude, or joy? Or is there no particular mood? Is it a story that is very neutral and very non-emotional when you look at it and when you think of what it evokes to you? I'd like you to just take a moment to think about that mood. And now I'd like to invite you to think about this story again and see, how would you tell it if I invited you to tell a story that is about anger? I'd like you to simply imagine, take a few seconds to imagine, how would you tell this same story that you've just told if I invited you to write it using anger as your leading emotion? Now I'd like you to think about it again. Think, what would it look like if you told this story and your dominant emotion was gratitude? Okay. So now I'd like to bring it back together and do a little exercise to simply sense the way, to what extent we have different stories that we tell ourselves in this room, or whether our stories converge. And the way that I'd like to do that is by slowly zooming out from the present moment, further and further in time, and see what happens. It's a little experiment. So you've just been writing a story of how we came to the present situation. And I imagine that as part of the story, you have written a series of events that caused each other and that led us to arrive here and that you deem to be important. So I'd like us to share some of those and invite you to take a piece of paper and think, in order for us to get to the situation that we're in now, what are the two most important things that happened in the last 5 years? What are the two most important things that happened in the last 5 years and that are leading us to, that have led us to the present situation? And if you happen to write 3, that's okay. And if just one comes to mind, maybe just one. And I'd like you to write them on a piece of paper, and then we will share them. Don't overthink it either.
Yeah, are we gonna share now?
Do you have it written down? So I'd like us to simply get a sense by showing them on the screen so that we can just see the diversity of what's happening in the room. And are we able to read them or not? Not really. The interface doesn't seem to allow that well. Oh, yeah, it is. Oops.
I just have horrendous handwriting, that's all.
Oh.
I'm much better on a
So maybe we'll... So what do we have? Ooh. Computer tech, smartphones, COVID, my son goes
to college and left home.
Ooh, police brutality, corruption, loss of jobs. Had COVID pandemic, Trump's election, and the Paris Agreement. We have Sam writing about risk something, American.
Reject norms, American right.
An American right. Good. So we see already that even within 5 years, we have quite divergent views of what the most important events might be. Now I'd like us to take a step back and think, what are the most important things that happened that led to the present moment or the present situation in the past 50 years?
15?
50, 50, 50. Are we there?
I'm gonna switch. Phew.
Mm.
Is it in the right side for others?
Yeah, it's doing a thing where yours doesn't appear right.
Oh, really?
Hmm.
Why?
Yours
don't
appears
know.
correct for me. I know mine's backwards for myself.
Yeah,
Okay.
others are right. So we have a triple on the rise of China. That's interesting. And we have a double on women's rights, but for the rest is it's diverging quite a lot. So now I'd like to look yet a bit further, and in order to take us to the present situation, what are the most important things that happened in the last 500 years? Remember, there is no right answer, but we've been doing a lot of reflection on centrality.
Good or bad, right?
Good or bad?
We're writing the same, Julia. Is it flipped for you guys? Sam, you can see it?
Yours is I can read. I think mine is flipped.
Okay, so it's
Very
it's dealing with it. Zoom is dealing with it.
Yeah.
Properly.
Very similar.
Trust in.
So we
Zoom.
have things that are echoing, but not everything. We have some convergence. And now I'd like to take another step. In order to take us to the place where we are today, what are the most important things that happened in the last 5,000 years?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Julien?
What are the
Same,
most
but
important
for
things that, same question, but in the last 5,000 years?
Hard getting the scale right. Like,
Last 5,000 years, that's 3000 BC.
yeah. Oh, it's just like just remembering when things actually happened.
Can we write the same themes that we did in the previous question, right?
Of course. And simply as a thought experiment, I'd like you to take 30 seconds thinking, what are the most important things to take us to the present moment that have happened in the last 50,000 years? Being in Australia, it's a scale of time that we're sometimes used to thinking about.
50,000?
50,000. And Leslie, are you on here? I'd like us to go into breakout rooms. Yes, okay. Beautiful. Could you send us to breakout rooms for 5 minutes?
Sure.
And in the breakout room, groups of 2, so pairs, people who haven't spoken to each other maybe. And I'd like us to simply discuss what was this experience like? What were some of the insights that you gained from it?
Okay.
So maybe Jan and Patrick, Sam and Makeda, and maybe Samir and Victor.
Oh, okay. Let me just redo it then.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry, one second. I don't know why it's still in that.
Good. I will be there for 5 minutes.
Yeah. I think it did a little bit of a different order just because I had sent through the click the button before you said okay.
No problem. Leslie, are we bumped out of the room at 45 sharp?
Let me just check the schedule. I think in this one we have some slight wiggle room. How long did we?
Oh,
Do you think you need
it's
it
going to
again?
finish at, it's going to finish around 45, but
Okay,
maybe
that
just
should,
1 extra minutes.
yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Wonderful.
We don't have another reshop right after, so it should be okay.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Leslie, can we bring people back in 1 minute?
Sure, no problem.
Thank you. Welcome back.
I didn't get to
So,
meet good the same.
sorry?
It was yeah, it was just a random breakout room. I thought I was gonna meet Patrick, but then I end up meeting Victor instead.
Oh, sorry about that.
It sounds like a selection prize.
So we're coming to the end of our workshop. I'd like to leave you simply with a quote attributed to Charlie Chaplin, that life is a tragedy when seen up close, but a comedy in long shot. And I'd like us to reflect about that as we think about the stretching exercises that we've just done. Stretching, looking at the spaces where we are and the spaces where other people may be, that we're on call with or that we interact with through screens. Stretches between the different centers of gravity that we have, the places where we live, and stretches in relation to the stories that we tell ourselves about the world that we inhabit, the systems that make up this world, and the extent of time or the causes that have led to the world being what it is. And if I had simply to reflect, what would it look like if we were able to go through life in a more flexible manner, being able to stretch a little more? And is there any chance that we could reduce the risk of tragedy and increase our capacity to look at life creatively and in the comic sense. And on that, I'd like to close inviting you to sum up your experience of this workshop with one gesture. And then we can take a screenshot and then all go our separate ways and continue with the conference. So just one gesture or one pause on the screen, summing up your experience of the workshop. Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Samir and Leslie, for moderating. Enjoy negotiating the new normal. Go and change the world, and have a beautiful rest of the day or evening, wherever you are.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure meeting you guys.
Julien.